Right, so I'll share the screen for the show. I'll give you a sort of breakdown of what I'm going to talk about really is about biosphere reserves for the uninitiated, because there's always some people within the audience that sort of don't quite know about what a biosphere reserve is. Some people still think it's Braunton Burrows, for example. And they'll quick sort of run through where we've got to, particularly with the Marine Pioneer, where we got to with that, and the sort of activities that we're actually doing at the moment, and looking at what happens next, and then sort of a glimpse into possibly what we'll be doing in the future in terms of our aspirations for the marine environment. So the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, so it's from an intergovernmental science program that UNESCO run. So we're a family of about 714 sites around the world that are chosen for their special characteristics in terms of sort of biodiversity, bioregional significance. So you have to be really good spot to be, recognized as a biosphere reserve in the first place. So that's one of the first criteria, is that you have to have that significance. So we have Braunton Burrows, but which was based on the original designation. So that's supposed to be one of the best dune systems in the Northern Hemisphere. But it does need upkeep and management, which is what a lot of the dynamic dunescapes is doing. But it also, we've got other places as well that we didn't actually include in the original designation and nomination, such as Lundy and the like, with its sort of speciality. So the way the biosphere reserves are set up, they have core, buffer and transition zones. Our core area is Braunton Burrows. We'll talk about that in a second. And the buffer and the transition extend much further out. So looking at the map there, you can see that we've got our core area here at Braunton Burrows, and the buffer is the AOMB and the SSSI around it. And the transition area, which is the area where you do most of the activity, extends out to 12 well, up to the median line between ourselves and Wales, because otherwise it would be an international thing, incident if we went over to Wales. And then following the 12 nautical mile limit, and then cutting back into Heartland there. And then the landside boundary is literally the watershed. So every land that drains to the North Devon coast is included within it. So we try to link all this as a system together, and how that works as one sort of complete unit. So linking the land and the sea, literally. And but I mentioned there about sort of Braunton Burrows being the core area. When we did a periodic review for UNESCO, which we need to do every 10 years, we also said, well, we'd like to have sort of more core areas, which delighted them. So what we want to do is work on having Lundy, the marine site, as another core area, and possibly having some of the moors and the bogs up on Exmoor and Dartmoor, and some of the calm grasslands as other core areas. So that means that for anybody living in the Biosphere Reserve, that means that there is something of a core, an international attraction that is near them, which makes it more relevant to them, because we're trying to link people and nature. And it's hard to link somebody who lives in Oakhampton with Braunton Burrows. It's not an obvious link, but if we said, actually in Oakhampton, you've got these fantastic pig bogs behind you, which are regulating your water, given all this carbon sequestration, etc. It's much easier to make that link between the people there and the benefits they get from that biodiversity. So the Biosphere Reserve has three functions: conservation, which is what you naturally expect; sustainable development, so that includes about how we live our lives, etc. How does that link in with our biodiversity, how we live in harmony with that nature; and then knowledge sharing, which is the research and dissemination, but also the training of locals and internationally. And we share that knowledge around the world. So moving on to our sort of history with the marine section, because we worked quite a lot with Coastwise and other partners to develop the marine conservation zones around North Devon, and finally sort of got those designated and agreed. And I think it was the Tranche 2 suite that we got most of our ones laid up. And that marine working group was very instrumental in sort of bringing that that piece of work together. And because of participation, like Coastwise within the organisation, we were complimented on the strong participation that we did achieve with developing these MCZs, and including those from the fishermen as well. So it was seen as a good example for the rest of the country on how to do that. Others did well, of course. We're not the only shining example in the country, but you know, it's just, we like to wave that flag every now and then. And then from that, we've done sort of various research programs, stuff with Europe and that sort of thing. But we then had this DEFRA Marine Pioneer. Now this is on the back of the 25-year environment plan that was being developed for DEFRA, where it was looking at natural capital approaches, because the Natural Capital Committee had said, you know, the UK is not doing too well with its natural capital. It needs to pull its socks up and actually sort of get to grips with how it runs and manages natural capital, because it's been eroded all the time. So hence the 25-year environment plan, which we had commented on in its drafting, etc. And then when the plan was finally done, they said, well, actually what it needs is a set of pioneer sites, pioneer areas that can demonstrate how to run and manage natural capital as part of the systems. So, and I'll explain about natural capital in a minute, but it is essentially what are the key habitats and their functions that allow us to have a good lifestyle. So what is it that they provide for us that makes life even possible or better? So it, you know, Tony Juniper wrote that thing, which is the parody of Monty Python and the Life of Brian. You know, what have the Romans ever done for us? So what has nature ever done for us? So it's actually acknowledging all those benefits, but it's not just the flow of those benefits, but where those benefits come from and what is the condition and extent of that habitat that's actually providing those benefits. Because if that piece of habitat is being eroded away, then the flow of benefits is going to get less. So it's about looking upstream, literally, and into where these habitats are that we're getting the benefits from. So that is the natural capital approach. So with the DEFRA Pioneer, we were asked to look at how would you look at managing natural capital in the marine environment. And we also had the Landscape Pioneer as well. So we actually had 2 of the 4 pioneers in the 25-year environment plan to manage. And we got the marine and terrestrial ones together because they wanted to see that interaction as well. So how does the land interact with the sea when you're managing natural capital? So with the Marine Pioneer, it was largely led by MMO. We had good partners like WWF UK, who sort of joined us in the program. They looked at sort of governance assessments. They helped us looked at innovative finance models, because again, one of the recognitions was that coming out of austerity, or even sort of still in austerity, that there wasn't a lot of public funds to actually sort of push into the management of natural capital. But there was a recognition that private sector does benefit quite a lot from this. And so there may be means and mechanisms in which we could get private investment into sustaining the natural capital of the environment. Some of the things we looked at there, we produced fisheries science and management plans for the key species, commercial species in the area. So we know that the idea of those plans was we can set what's the status of the plant, of the species, what's the management and the policy that's got us to here to date, what's the big science behind it, but then how do you sort of go forward in trying to adopt that into management? And those have been sort of very strong documents to use, because now they've been recognized nationally as being a way to actually start looking at how we change fisheries management. So we've still got a bit of work to do with these. You know, we've still got some mileage with these plans to actually do. They're not just sitting there on the shelf. We'll be actually looking in the future about sort of fisheries management. Something we did with the Pioneer was as well, just on the Clovelly herring there, we looked at, you know, what were some of the key species we wanted to look at. So Blue Marine Foundation sponsored some research into the herring, just because they thought it was a nice artisanal fishery, you know, where the rules are you can't use any power to cast your nets and then sort of bring the fish in, harvest the fish. It has to be all done from these picarooners, which are, you know, sail powered or oar powered if there's no wind. And so they thought there was a nice story behind it. But when they looked at the fish that were being landed, we sent those for some work with Swansea University, who confirmed that the Clovelly herring, at least the first ones that come in, are both morphologically and genetically distinct from the rest of the herring that are caught in the Bristol Channel. So the received wisdom to date was that herring tend to spawn up around the Isle of Man, up in the sort of sandy sort of beds up there, and then they come down the Irish Sea into the Bristol Channel, then sweep up the Bristol Channel, and that's it. But what this particular study looked at was, it said, well, the first herring that come into Clovelly 2 or 3 weeks before the rest are different from the rest, and therefore they must have different grounds in which they're spawning. And that's our next job, is to try and find out where they are spawning from, because we need to make sure we're protecting those. Because one of the things we were looking at within that natural capital approach in the marine plan there was, what are the critical fish habitats that need to be safeguarded so we can still keep the the production of fisheries, wild fisheries and wild caught fisheries. So that's a clear example of the natural capital part. So what is the habitat that needs to protect to make sure we have the flow of benefits, i.e. the fish, coming up for us to catch and eat? And so we're still sort of in the process of trying to identify where the Clovelly herring really do come from, which is going to be quite a challenge. So we're looking at sort of ideas of acoustics, etc., with a local company, in fact, called Seish, up at Bradworthy. And as I mentioned, the innovative finance model. So again, some of the work we did with WWF was to say, well, what does it cost to run a good marine protected area? And using Lundy as an example, and Scoma and the like, and they reckon, that it needs about £700,000 per annum to run a good MPA in terms of governance, research, enforcement, education, etc. So they identified the huge funding gap that we have, because I don't think Lundy actually really gets £700,000 a year. That's kind of what a good one would look like. And when you think that we have another 5 MCZs that we need to be considering, then our financial gap is huge. Like we try to manage them as a cluster, or we will be managing them as a cluster, so we can get some economies of scale and savings. But it means that through that, we've identified a massive gap in the finances to actually run an MCZ. And as you know, with Devon and Severn IFCA, they have been, they found it a challenge to actually sort of meet the statutory management needs of the MCZs, because they just don't have the resources within to do that. So again, this is looking at how we can look at those ways to bring in that innovative finance, that investment, that means we can go beyond the statutory and actually sort of get things done. But it needs to be underpinned by statutory monitoring at least. And then finally, what we did produce was a marine natural capital plan. So that is a plan for the next 10, 20 years that will looks at how we manage those natural marine assets and what is the benefits we can have for that. So the idea we can look at any blue marine development or blue carbon development and see what we can do that makes sure it doesn't do any harm to the natural capital assets, but in other ways actually tries to enhance them. So whether that's aquaculture, or if we can actually then use an extension of MCZs, or looking at fisheries management where we can improve fish stocks, but also the habitats at the same time as for other benefits, for biodiversity benefits, carbon sequestration, nutrient turnover and the like. And within that, we also had SWEEP. SWEEP is a academic partnership that we work with, which is the acronym is always a bit strange because it's the Southwest Partnership for Environmental and Economic Prosperity. So it should be SWEEP, but it is, they just called it SWEEP for obvious reasons. And through that, we had different tools developed, such as the sustainability appraisal for marine planning, which has been adopted by the local authorities, and MMO sort of were quite interested in it for marine planning. And we also had some work that I did with the University of Exeter on the economic valuation of salt marsh. So using all these different factors of aesthetics, enjoyment, as well as carbon sequestration, etc., where and what are the most valuable salt marshes in and around the estuary. It came up with some very interesting ones, is that if we're going to create a new site, what are the cost benefits of each of those things? And creating a new salt marsh site, the most valuable per hectare was the one that was actually sort of Pilton Park, where it was something like sort of 4 or 5 times the value of any other salt marsh that you might sort of put in around the estuary. And that was purely because of the proximity to people. So it produced a way of trying to possibly prioritize where you would invest in salt marshes, but that was purely on an economic basis. It wasn't sort of anything based on the logistics, if you like, of hydrodynamics and sort of tidal morphology, etc., and geomorphology. But it was an interesting piece of work nonetheless. So I'll just picture the Clovelly herring there. I'm not going to say that the ones on the right are the Clovelly specific herrings and the other ones are the rest of the Bristol Channel ones or anything, but it's just, there you go. Another project we did really at the request of the minister, Therese Coffey, when they were setting up natural flood management demonstrations was, well, if you're a pioneer, maybe you should be doing a coastal natural flood management. We were doing some natural flood management work in the riparian areas up in the river catchments, but the request was, could we do something that is marine related in terms of natural flood management and showing how it works? So this again is using soft engineering on natural systems to try and reduce the costs or extend the life of flood defences in and around the coast. There was another coastal one being done over in Essex, but they couldn't get anything off the ground there because they were sort of being hampered by different sort of licensing mechanisms. We're quite fortunate where we have a good relationship and a good level of trust with our local environment agency and MMO office. So we were proposing systems that they were quite happy with. So first one down there is in-store dunes, where there was a problem of the sand blowing over onto the road all the time, and it was filling up the drains and it was causing a bit of flooding. But a major thing was this this traffic nuisance. So we came up with a system there to train. What essentially the problem there is the dunes are trying to roll inland and develop, but they're rolling inland onto the road. So what we came up there was a system to train the dunes so they would actually move a little bit further out and build the dunes just a little bit further down the beach, which meant that the sand wouldn't actually reach the road. And the idea that we're trying to get these as long, low, flat dunes rather than steep, high ones. So because obviously people sort of value the view from those houses there in particular, and but also they didn't like the sand coming into their doorways. So we put in some jute fencing into that area and created these pens which then trap the sand. And that work started on the first day of lockdown back in 2020. Was it the first day of lockdown anyway? We can't remember the years now, it just kind of fades into oblivion. And it's worked really well. Over the storms over the winter, it was quite obvious that down at the southern end of the beach, the sand was still piling there and going right over the top and sort of spilling onto the road, whereas here, the sand that was trapped into the fences that we put in around here, these pens, it didn't get sort of past the wall. And it just needs sort of minor sort of maintenance to actually sort of just pull the sand away so the water can drain away. And if there's a lot of water, it tends to flush it away anyway. So it's worked really, really well. We're really pleased with it. There was a little bit of consternation from some of the locals at the time, and I think that's faded away. But some people are now asking, can we move the fencing or extend the fencing further down the beach, for example, so we can continue that benefit further down. And these dunes have been growing here for the last 150 years, as far as we can tell from old maps and aerial photographs, and it is going to grow that way. It's one of the nicer problems to have, is to have too much sand rather than too little, because I don't know if anybody saw the piece on the news, I think it must have been Spotlight last week, where they were talking about some of the sand issues down in Cornwall, where they don't have enough sand and the beaches are eroding really fast. And then in the winter, when the beach levels drop, the waves hit these walls with much larger power and start breaking down those walls, and you get overspill onto the other side. So we've actually got the benefit of having more sand than we need. It's just trying to keep it in the right place and making sure we're still getting the benefits of those dunes to be a flood defence. So that's worked really well. The ones that you've seen over in Bronson in particular, where we've experimented, is using brushwood faggots to pin down onto the bank there, because we noticed when Horsey Island was flooding initially that sediment was getting trapped in some spots, which is really good. That's what we want, is to build up the sediment and warp it up, because that then encourages salt marsh, which then traps more sediment and then adds more resilience to the bank. and salt marshes are good at attenuating waves. So what we did here was we adopted a practice that is done in Germany on some of the big marshes out there. And we did this with, from arising from hedgeling up in Exmoor, as well as locally, gathered all this, and the contractors sort of bound them up and so we pinned them in. And the idea of that is it attenuates any sort of waves that are eroding at this sort of bottom end of the bank. It also means that sediment has time to drop, so we can actually sort of build up the sediment here. And it means that then salt marsh plants will then build up as well. So there was some salt marsh developed there already, but this will accelerate it. So it, and we've seen the benefit of that already. And the marsh inspectors have said they're well pleased with it. They think it's working really well. And they can see that as being something that's going to really help their sort of bank be easier to maintain and give it length of service. And then the other thing we did with the NFM was we ran what we called a SLAM model, which is sea level rise and marsh management. And that project, we use topographic analysis, tidal analysis, and put all the land use data into the land cover data into the model, using sort of very fine resolution. We started off with 2 meter, but that was too much for it to work with. So we put it in 10 meter resolution. And this runs and simulates over the next 100 years what marshes are going to develop where and what types and where we're going to lose sediment, etc. moving forward. So that's been quite a good piece of work to help us look at planning the future of the estuary. We had the regime model that we did with John Pethick a few years ago, and this produced similar results. So they do sort of support each other in the kind of approaches we want to do. But what we wanted to look at was, we need to look at what does a healthy estuary look like in the future, because we need salt marsh, we need those intertidal areas, and with sea level rise, unless you actually modify flood defences, then your intertidal area gets smaller and shorter. You lose salt marsh, and therefore you lose the benefits of the salt marsh as well. And something we're just sort of completing now is the Biocultural Heritage Tourism Project. It's an ugly title, but the French guys liked it. That's about sort of linking people and the reasons they come down to the area to give them a sort of real genuine experience, but also as a means to help disperse the pressure, if you like, from the coastal sites. So we some of the outputs there were about supporting businesses to sort of make this transition towards looking at more diffuse ways of having visitors, developing new activities, whether that was up at Simmons Bath or in some of the woodlands out and around the area. We developed a master planning tool, which I'll show in a second, and we've developed the Biosphere Business Partner Network, which is getting all the businesses that want to sort of follow our values, if you like, an ethos for the area, and use that to underpin their way of working with visitors and residents, and create a more sustainable business. So that business park network now has about 55 businesses within it, so it's exceeded its targets within the first year really well. We're setting up a visitor investment or visitor payback. It's going to be called, it is going to be called VIP. So visit, invest, protect is the idea behind it. So people come along, they see how great it is, and then they want to give us some money towards its maintenance and keep it going. And something we've also done is reviewed and revised and extended the skipper training. So those people taking trips to visitors out around Lundy or around Moor Point or whatever, is to make sure that they behave in the correct way so they don't disturb the marine mammals too much. But also we give them the tools and the equipment and the training to make sure that they can talk knowledgeably about the things that they're seeing, and give the visitor a better experience. And the other thing we just developed, which should be launched in the next 2 weeks, is the North Devon Tourism app. So given originally this was just going to be an app just for Braunton Burrows when we first sort of set up the project, about how to enjoy the different sites and the different assets on Braunton Burrows, whether it's the historical heritage or whether it is the natural heritage. But when COVID happened and there was lockdown, and then it was suddenly, lockdown was lifted, and we had this deluge of people coming into the area, we realized that what we need to do is try and manage and ease the way that people sort of get around the area, because Saunton Sands car park fills up at 9:30. Then you've got a traffic jam right through to Braunton at 10 o'clock. And what does that do for the life of people who live in Braunton? It's just not great. And that's kind of repeated right across the area, different beaches, Northam as well as Woolacombe. So the idea of this app is that it actually gives real-time traffic information on the app. It can then sort of suggest if you're heading to the beach, maybe you want to go to this beach instead because it's less crowded. Also, if you're wanting to do this, why don't you do an activity here in Torrington, for example? So it actually sort of takes people away from the coast and eases the pressure. And some of that is informed, I mentioned, by this master planning module that we set up with a GIS system that Exeter and ourselves developed. So that looks at all the habitats, their sensitivities, the visitors, the numbers, what's the infrastructure around there, and looks at all those different opportunities and ideas. And then we sort of run that through different scenarios of, we've got a baseline of how it is now, projecting 30 years into the future using kind of business as usual, projecting the same time frame ahead with unregulated growth, just like WTO rules, just sort of stack it high, sell it cheap. What is the impact? And interesting, that's not that different from the business as usual when you look at the results. And then sort of taking a more stewardship approach about trying to manage the tourists in different ways. You can see that the result of the pressures, the sort of the very dark areas, that they're going to still be the ones under pressure. They're the bits that sort of need to be more carefully managed. Whereas the rest, if you take that stewardship approach, you have lots of opportunities to develop sort of different, what we call these biocultural or sort of authentic biosphere experiences. So our next stage is to work with the planning authorities and with whatever destination management organization transpires to try and develop this model further so we can then encourage a better kind of tourism within the area. So the stuff that's happening now, because that's the bits of kind of where we got to, we've literally just started these projects. So one is Critter, which follows on from the SLAM model and the work that we've done in the estuary. So this is largely Environment Agency funded work where we are going to look at recreate 100 hectares of salt marsh to compensate for the loss with sea level rise. So the trouble is when you create salt marsh, it tends to happen over grazing marsh or good habitat like that. So the idea is that what we will do is create new grazing marsh in replacement for where the salt marsh is created. So we've identified a number of sites where we can do that, and these have been using some of those tools from the EA and from SWEEP to look at what the investment is, what the benefits would be, what's the sequestration of carbon likely to be, how can we finance these, etc. So we've got a 6-year project ahead to sort of try and deliver that. So we are in the role now of sort of trying to get the team together, but one thing we still need is a coastal habitat specialist to do the work that I used to do in terms of the salt marsh identification sites, the design and the feasibility studies. So we need, if anybody knows a good coastal habitat specialist who wants to join us and start working with landowners to flood land in different ways, please give us a shout. We need to start ASAP on that one. And something we are experimenting there, you see there, is seagrass. And so we know that historically there may have been seagrass in here. And Paula tells me that Tegwin Harris had said those, yes, there's some out here. There is a rumour there was some out along here, and MMO said there might be historically been some there. So there has been some national research which says, kind of on a meta basis, this is where it could happen. And it's certainly inside the estuary is the only place where we think we could actually try and be successful with seagrass on intertidal basis. If you move outside into the bay, I think it's too turbid to actually sort of get any success in terms of subtidal. So we think our best option is going to be inside the bay, inside the estuary with intertidal. So we are looking to experiment that with the Ocean Conservation Trust, who are doing the work down in Plymouth, to look at where we can do those sites. So that'll be experimental feasibility. The one we're looking at is with the River Humber. We're doing that now. We've actually been doing it for a couple of years, and that's where we were originally called in to look at flood risk in Combe Martin, and we looked at all the catchment of the Humber and seeing where we can put in some natural capital interventions, natural flood management to reduce the flows. And then South West Water said, actually, we have a problem as well because of the bathing water quality, as we all know in Combe Martin gets iffy at best. And it is on the cusp of being delisted as a bathing beach, which would be, not good news for the tourism industry down there. So we're working now with South West Water to see how these measures and other measures can reduce the fecal bacteria loading down at the bathing beach. So we did a lot of tree planting last year, which South West Water largely funded, and the results on bathing water quality this year is it's gone from failing to excellent. I wouldn't say that was all because of the tree planting. I think it's largely been down to weather, and it's been down to the CSOs not happening at a time when the bathing water was being monitored, because I think there were 2 or 3 events. But I think some of that success can be put down to the tree planting we have done and the land use change we've achieved. And we've got another 2 years of that to do. So we're putting in a lot of effort into the Combe Martin area. And now tacked on top of that is this smart biosphere. So this is where we're trying to use digital sensors to see how we can monitor, measure, but also try and manage the catchments to see what we can reduce problems before they happen. So that's putting in an array of river and soil sensors to monitor those impacts. And then we use artificial intelligence modeling. So you're working with people at Rothamsted and University of Exeter to put in these AI packages, which means that we can look at what are the patterns and we can predict any flood events or pollution events before they happen and try and do something about it, or at least mitigate any damage. And we'll use that as a template for applying across the Biosphere Reserve. So we've got stage 2 and stage 3 of the Smart Biosphere coming up. So, I mean, it is really about sort of trying to sort of bring together all these different tech together to try and monitor these things. So we get the monitoring from the tech side, but also the benefits coming out of it means that we can apply that technology in a way that we can make it easier to do monitoring and verification for those ecosystem services, for example. So it means that the cheaper you can do your monitoring, then the better you can sell the carbon price, for example, or the more profit you make on the carbon price, which just makes good economics for that natural capital approach. And this is just a kind of a schema of where the sensors are going in, sort of dot out throughout that catchment, and working with all the landowners that we're grateful to for allowing us to stick the sensors in all over their land and down through the village there to monitor things. So what's happening next? And obviously on the news, you've heard about our Community Renewal Fund, and we'll talk about the Marine Nature Recovery Plan and the reintroduction of water walls at Braunton, which some of you may or may not know about. So with the Community Recovery Fund, we did have this, what we call a blue-green growth accelerator program we've devised to go in there, which looks at, again, following on from the Marine Natural Capital Plan, how will we get the benefits of investment into the area? How do we attract that investment into the area that's going to be sustainable, create new jobs, but is actually sort of going to be better for the environment as well? So how do you get those win-wins? And so we've got this idea of using natural capital to you restore nature through sort of these various different means. We adapt to climate change. We're getting climate change resilience, and we're trying to use the method to create local jobs and stop that sort of outward migration of young people from the area, and trying to sort of create sort of young jobs for young people. So it's got sort of several components there. So we've got sustainable aquaculture enterprise zones. This is where we're trying to literally sort of come up with a way we can develop aquaculture in the area that's going to be sustainable. It's going to have a beneficial impact rather than a negative impact. It's not going to be like the sea pens of salmon up in Western Scotland, where there was all the problems of nutrient dropout coming out from the salmon pens themselves, but looking at multi-level or multi-trophic systems. Using aquaculture for bioremediation inside the estuary is something we'll be looking at and exploring. This would be possibly either using seaweed or putting a load of bivalves in the subtidal area, and the filtering that they do in terms of taking out fecal indicators, other pollutants, and metabolizing those, so that we could get a lot of pings. Did I say something wrong? So we, excuse me. So the idea of the bioremediation is it'll actually help clean up the estuary. But what we don't want to do is just kind of provide an end of pipe solution, because we know we still have big problems up in the catchment that's causing that in the first place. And it probably is better to solve those upstream in that source. But at least if we can sort of do the bioremediation downstream as well, it does help alleviate some of the problems. But it's not going to be the be all and end all to fix it. Blue carbon is about looking at how we invest in salt marshes, seagrass, and also kelp, if we can. So we're working with a number of organisations on that. I mentioned the Ocean Conservation Trust, for example, and that's where there's a kind of an overlap with the Critter project. And I'm also involved in a Horizon 2020 European research programme with PML on some of the blue carbon aspects as well, and particularly kelp. Anna Keros, who is part of PML's team, her expertise is in kelp. So we have, you know, some of the MCZs, which are intertidal reefs with kelp. Can we extend the kelp seaward, for example? Would that be a way to actually achieve this? But also we need to look at the future resilience of that, because if the water gets too warm, then kelp doesn't actually reproduce. So what is going to be the right system that's going to work into the future? The offshore renewables. So this is largely sort of looking at the middle dock at Appledore, which is owned by Torridge District Council, but it's right next to Harland and Wolff shipyard now. And what is going to be the future options there in terms of working with an offshore renewables industry without actually getting so big that it actually just dominates the whole estuary. So it's, as you know, there's different developments being proposed offshore in the Celtic Sea, and one a little bit closer, White Cross, as they call it. And so we want to sort of see if North Devon can benefit from those in a way that is fitting for the area, rather than actually sort of dominate the whole thing. And then we've got the integrated marine management plans. That's extending from, what we're going to do is an assessment of the Lundy MCZ no-take zone, look at the impacts of that and the benefits, working with the fishermen, etc., and see if there are other places where we can implement that kind of approach of no-take zone, statutorily, voluntarily, permanent, temporary, etc., and then sort of come up with a way of how we can manage the whole of the biosphere marine area in a way that gives us dynamic approach, which means that we can get habitats being restored, some of those species coming back sort of better and stronger with that runoff. And that would obviously include the idea of the Clovelly herring as well, if it spawns within the biosphere reserve. We don't really know where it spawns, but we need to find that out. And then, of course, we've got the Smart Biosphere program as well, with the natural flood off and management that we're doing within that. So just a quick thing on the 3D ocean farming. This is this multi-layer, multi-trophic layer aquaculture that we described. It's been sort of promoted from the USA. It may not work here. There's different things, you know, because of the turbidity in the water column and the tide, etc. But this is a much cleaner system than, as mentioned, like the salmon pens. So because you're creating different habitats with those multi-trophic areas with growing seaweed and mussels on ropes, etc., and oysters in cages, you are creating different habitats. Will actually sort of bring in other species of fish around it, so you can do rod and line catching as well. And the spatial requirements are going to be sort of fairly small. And we're talking with the guys who are actually sort of looking at their seaweed farming that they're proposing off Clovelly to see how this fits together. But our aim for this is, if we can get the system set up and a block licensing approved, rather than it being big companies, corporates, etc., from elsewhere, just hoovering up the opportunity, is we'll try and protect this so that it can be local investment, so local people can invest in this, is their business, and then sort of, if you like, sub-license that aquaculture within it. So that's our plan for that. So again, it's all about that sort of mix of ecosystem services, developing marine tourism around it. It's not just about what you produce, but it's about the processes around it and how you can add value to all those different activities with it, such as the tourism side. I think that just about covers it. So the Marine Nature Recovery Plan is, we just got some money from Environment Agency for the from 3Cs. So this is to produce the marine equivalent of the Nature Recovery Plan that we've just produced on land. And Martin Batt has been leading the coastal one, which sort of extended into the intertidal area. But this is to really sort of wrap up the whole of the marine part, but not inside the estuary, because the coastal group did a good job on that part. And actually sort of then cover that those marine components, because the criticism of natural capital is it tends to look at those big systems, but it misses out the special species, for example, that may not be sort of ultimately really beneficial for human benefits, because it's the natural capital approach and the ecosystem approach are very anthropocentric in the way that they do things. It's all about what are the goods for humans coming from this, but what about the leopard-spotted goby and or the red bandfish or whatever? What are their benefits in terms of to humans? But it's actually trying to sort of wrap up all these things and leave nothing behind in many ways. So it'll cover the entire marine area, as I mentioned, and it'll go beyond the statutory that is needed for MCZs, because we have to accept that the MCZs are going to do their sort of features of conservation interest and focus on those, which means that there's a huge area of the MCZ that is just not being supported or addressed or even sort of benefiting from that designation. So this is going sort of beyond that statutory of the features of conservation interest. And so it'll also sort of create then a set of off-the-shelf ready projects. So we can then sort of bid into programs where we can to actually sort of to deliver the biodiversity plans. That's where it is. So participation is going to be paramount in this. So if it's be with the Marine Working Group, Coastwise is a member of the working group. So again, there'll be workshops being developed where we would expect, really hope, desire, need Coastwise to work with us on this because of the expertise that you have within the group to look at what are the species that we really need or really need that support and conservation in terms of the Marine Recovery Plan. And then looking sort of briefly to the future, we want to implement the Marine Nature Recovery Plans, so possibly with lottery funding or whatever funding we can find to do that. And again, that implementation needs partners like Coastwise to work with us to do that. We'll be looking to work on the Cane wetlands with the Wildlife Trust. I mentioned waterfalls and I didn't say about it. We are in the first phase of introducing waterfalls at Braunton Marsh up in the wet areas, and that is around the triple SIs of greenways, fresh marsh and swamp pool. The first phase is checking there aren't any predators that are going to decimate any waterfalls that we bring up. So for the next 3-4 months, we'll be monitoring all the ditches, looking for mink in particular, and see if there's any particular problem, but also surveying the habitats and seeing if how much habitat is really suitable for the voles to come up. But this is the first phase of reintroduction. So we've been seeing different programs like reintroducing ratty from Win in the Willows. And this is what it's about. So that'll be part of the Cane Wetlands project. We're working with Devon Wildlife Trust. We have low impact fisheries development. So the local fishermen have been working with us for some years and looking at ideas that they can develop where they reduce the impact of fisheries, because they recognise that there is an impact, and they would rather see sustainable fisheries. They are sort of talking to us the right kind of terms. And to be honest, if we sort of develop and devise low impact fishery rules, it means that people from outside the area can't really come in and fish because they wouldn't be able to comply with those rules, because it wouldn't be worth their while. There was the same amount of people exercised about the large Dutch super trawler that came in around the bay 2 weeks ago, for example. So that sort of thing wouldn't be allowed to happen if we can develop this kind of low fisheries impact regulation. And through that, we'll also want to build a program for regional management of fisheries. So at the moment, it's all very top-down, ICs, etc. But the more research that we do on the genetics of fish and their distribution and tagging them, is that, you know, they are more localized populations. They don't move too far. So it probably needs a refresh, a reappraisal of how we manage fisheries on a more local scale, rather than using the blunt tool of national stroke international, but making sure that we are still sort of supporting international targets, but it just comes down to the nuances of the management. And again, so to keep on sort of maintaining the good science base to determine marine decisions. So again, what is the monitoring, etc., we can put in place using that smart and tech systems. Through all this, we want to look at the mechanisms for marine net gain, and perhaps the Marine Nature Recovery Plan will provide some of those mechanisms, because as different developments come online, like different wind farms, etc., then if we can use their net gain or offset requirements in our area, then we can benefit from that hugely. So they're delivered again by a range of partners. And again, sort of continue our work with Plastic Free North Devon in sort of reducing the plastics getting into the marine environment. And again, so on the tourism side, you know, this engage with locals and visitors to connect with the marine world and help them learn to love it. And again, that is where I think Coastwise has a key role to play with us on doing that. And I think that's me.